One of the most important keys to success is to not fall prey to the victim mentality. You have to be able to see the opportunity that's there. Adam?
I've been advocating for the young guys is we need to get into whatever the old guys are getting out of. Look for opportunities that they do not want or they can't see or they can't take on, whether it's more physical, whether it's more smaller parcels. Whatever business model that the big guys are in, kind of go find around the edges where they can't maneuver.
Today, we're going to talk to Adam Lasch about what he sees as the opportunity, especially for the small, scrappy, first-generation farmer and rancher.
I think there's opportunity in livestock. I really do, especially with the cover crops and the amount of forage we can grow and just the lack of infrastructure. Let's be honest, a lot of the old guys, they don't want to mess with cattle. So there's a lot of land that is not being utilized the way it probably should be or could be. As more people have been shoehorned into corn and soybean, and that as the margin bleeds out of that, there's going to be opportunity for guys to grow forage and graze cattle going ahead.
All that and more on this episode 479 of the Working Cows podcast, brought to you by Ranch Right and the Tire Winder.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows podcast, recorded exclusively in the Understanding Ag Studios. Very excited to be joined by Adam Lasch. Adam is a guy that I've followed on X for a while now and really have appreciated his way of thinking. Again, as I said in the intro to the last episode with Bart Carmichael, it's more important to learn how someone thinks than it is to learn what they do. Because if you can learn how to think the way they think, you can learn how to solve problems the way they solve problems in a way that fits your own context. So always happy to have somebody who's thinking outside the box and thinking differently and ask them some questions about how they think and about what is capturing their attention right now. So we'll have that conversation with Adam right after a word from our sponsor today, Ranch Right.
Does a year's worth of tax prep stand between you and being able to send things to your accountant? Are you tired of email after email asking for documents that you don't know how to find? Are you wondering exactly how much money you're going to owe the IRS this year and have no clue how to even start to figure that out? We've been there, but you don't have to. Hire Ranch Right today and know where your business stands. After all, taxes are a part of life, but Ranch Right helps you with data entry, bookkeeping, gives you reports that you can make sense of, and helps with a realistic outlook of what your business needs this tax season. Visit www.ranchright.llc today and cross tax prep off your list.
Thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows podcast.
Appreciate it, Clay. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, always appreciate your takes on X or Twitter or whatever we're calling it this week. And one of them caught my eye earlier this week or last week, and about an analogy of where we're at in agriculture. And, your analogy, just briefly, I'll summarize it, and I'll have a link in the show notes page for today to the tweet thread that you put up. But basically, you got two train tracks and a gravel road running parallel. One of them is a bullet train, and it can do one thing, carry people really fast. The other one's a freight train, moves slower, carries lots of freight. And the other one is the gravel road, where there's a pickup and trailer going and can't move as fast as the bullet train, can't carry as much stuff as the freight train, but it can change directions quickly and pivot and go back. And so I think your illustrations were that the freight train, the bullet train, was the super specialized, requires all the right conditions and subsidies to be able to function. Ultra equipped to win the speed race, but not equipped to haul anything other than people. And then the freight train is the multi-generational, high-equity family farm. Pull a big load and just keep chugging along, but they're tethered to the same government-built bullet train track. And then the gravel road is the first-gen guy, and he can pivot quickly and make a shift, and so I just kind of like to flesh that out a little bit and think a little bit more about that with you and see where we're at and what some of these different operations can do to prepare for, changes in the future and some of those things. So what else would you add to my summary of your tweet thread there? And then we'll pick it back up.
Well, let's flesh it out a little bit. Where are we at in agriculture? We've got a serious demographic cliff coming. There's more people over the age of 65, more farmers over the age of 65 than there are under the age of 55. So that's a huge, we're out of whack. If you think about, the equity and the wealth that has been accumulated by that older generation, they've just simply had more time to accumulate the wealth and to refine their business. And they're really, really like honed in on a certain model. And in today's day and age with the, kind of the model that everybody's been pushed towards, especially after the soybean market and the cattle market meltdown here the last few days, the row crops are the easiest path. So everybody has gotten onto those two train tracks. The way I describe it is the bullet train is like the BTO. They're going to move the most bushels in the fastest amount of time. They're hyper refined in their capital structure. They're in their marketing structure. They're extremely refined. They're extremely sleek, but they can only really go one way, like as fast as they can. They can't really pivot. They're not going to be able to, if it isn't corn, soybeans, or wheat maybe, or some of the other crops, you're not really going to have much of a chance to do much. They're not going to hook cattle cars to it and switch over to grazing stockers on wheat pasture. It's just not going to happen. So they're literally the most tied to those extremely specialized business model. The high gen, the multi-gen, high net worth, freight train has been trucking along for years. They may be the third, fourth, fifth generation. They've got their land base, they've got their equity, their equipment place, their equipment is purchased and in pretty good shape. But again, they're kind of tied to that same model of corn and soybeans in this day and age, And then the analogy of the gravel road is there may be potholes, the pickup may have a flat tire, but they can stop in anywhere and they're not going to get run over. And if they have to, they can turn around. They can even go cross country, to chase something over the horizon if they want. And when I was trying to come up with that analogy is we've got, looking ahead, we know that the train tracks, so they can only go one direction, and they're locked into that model. And that model is literally built by government. There is no other alternative. There's no free market in these greens and corns and soybeans stuff right now. They're highly tethered to that business model. Whereas I'm trying to give hope to the first generation, saying there is opportunity to move and maneuver if you have the ability to see opportunity, chase it, maybe pick up pieces left by the other guys, and are willing to kind of go with the flow and figure out where you can go, what you can do.
Yeah. So in your mind, what separates the big time operator from the fourth, fifth generation? What are some of the things that are different between those two?
So I would say the multi-gen guys are probably have they probably own more of their land base. Both of them are highly dependent on rented acres, more than likely. The big time operator has probably refined that even more. And the multi-gen guys, maybe there's a future coming, younger generation coming in, lots of equity, big time cash cushion, we'll say. One of my friends likes to joke that if you have never had to go cut blocks to change a tire, you're not a first gen guy, because it seems like every multi-gen guy has always had the stack of blocks from decades ago sitting in a portion of their shop, ready to go at a moment's notice. And I'm at the point where I think the more tethered you are to the whims of government right now, especially with, like I said, in light of the soybean thing. 3 weeks ago, soybeans were a dead, non-existent crop, and all of a sudden now they're up 75 or 25 cents here in the last couple of days. So on a tweet, it's fraught with danger.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that the two, the bullet train and the freight train in your illustration, the big time operator and the fourth and fifth generation farm, the things that they have in common are that they were, or they have operated in the model that took Earl Butts literally, big, get out,
Yeah.
farm fence row to fence row. And so that's what they're doing, right?
Yep. And it's been decades of that. I mean, if you think about since ethanol and since, kind of the freedom to farm in 96, which model has everybody kind of been shoved towards, we don't grow a lot of oats anymore. We don't grow a lot of different forage crops or, stuff like that. We've kind of consolidated to the point. I believe we're at the end of the cycle, meaning you're going to have different opportunities going forward than you have today, or what got us to this point. And I don't think any of us know what that means, looking ahead. I mean, is the cattle industry going to go the way of the sheep, where it's kind of I'll say a boutique meat? Or are we going to start contracting the crop acres, with the rise of Brazil and China's apparent desire not to have to buy from us? I don't know.
Sure. And so, yeah, do you think that what has been driving this reality that we are currently seeing? Like, what was it that of course the influence of the head of the USDA, but that's, almost 100 years ago or something like that. So what has been driving this current trajectory that we've been on, where it's get big or get out?
Let's go back to, people like to think I hate on the boomers, and I'm not. I'm simply trying to illustrate that they are the largest generation in history. And when you have that many people coming into any one industry at any one time, you are going to have distortion. So what happened to the boomers were born from 44, 46 into, I would say, early 1960. They were a big generation. They have basically, you look at the 1950s, there were schools going everywhere because there were so many kids. Big families, lots of, it was the Cultural Revolution of the U.S., especially into the 60s. The whole Woodstock thing and the awakening that they had as their youth. If they're 20-year-old in 1960. Take that a little bit further. All of a sudden, in the 1970s, we start getting some inflation, and they're settling down. They're starting to build lives. They're buying houses. They're starting to have kids. They're basically becoming adults. And what does a young guy in 1975 want to hear when Earl Butt says, "Get bigger, get out, start farming, fence row to fence row"? He basically, every young guy wants to hear that. Let's tear up the ground. Let's start farming. Let's make that smoke happen. Let's grow bigger crops. Let's go. They have a lot of energy at that stage, and they're excited. They want to go. They do. Okay. What does that lead to? Kind of the 80s, kind of we hyper financialized in the late 70s. We pushed everything way up, had a lot of energy from a lot of youth all trying to get into farming at the same time. It pushed assets up. We had kind of loose monetary policy for all these young people throughout society. What happened? It kind of cratered in on itself in the 1980s, 81, 82, started to really fall apart. Then kind of bottomed in 86, 87. Okay, so that if you survived the 80s, you've had a pretty good run since then. What interest rates topped at 21% sometime in the early 80s, and interest rates have declined basically up until a few years ago at that point. So if you survived the 80s and you were getting in then, you were, say, maybe 30 years old, now look at you. You've had a good run. So that's that BTO and that multi-gen space. They've been able to really consolidate. They've been able to really specialize. They've had a pretty favorable tailwind since about 2005, when the RFS, the renewable fuel standard, got put in, got passed. So they hyper specialized. So what did that lead to? Okay, crop insurance got better and better and better, and that basically helped consolidate everybody. If you could raise your APH, you had that kind of that the floor under your production with the multi-peril crop insurance. You could basically farm, and as long as you were halfway smart with your marketing and you did a decent job and produced a good crop, you were pretty much guaranteed to make something. And in the environment with pretty loose monetary policy, declining interest rates for decades, what happens? Everybody gets bigger, everybody specializes, because that's what's been rewarded in that system. So going forward, are we confident that the exact same situations that led us to where we are today are going to continue into the future? I'm not so sure of that.
Yeah, it would seem unsustainable, right? I mean, a host of these things, a host of the realities that have gotten us to where we are now would seem unsustainable. And so you would assume that there's coming some kind of a pivot, and, depending on the predictor of the pivot, it can be more or less catastrophic, right?
Right. I don't know if we're going to have a washout. I don't know if we can have something similar to the 80s because the equity position is just so high. Um, but we could have more of a kind of like a stagnation. There were 75 million boomers. They're all hitting retirement now. Okay. In farming, because of the technology and because there hasn't really been a reason to get out, what has happened? We have a lot fewer young people getting in. There's a lot less opportunity. Okay. Well, at some point, these old guys are going to be forced out by death, by the fact that they can't physically do it. What happens to those acres? I mean, a lot of people will say, "Oh, it'll just get gobbled up by more bigger guys." Maybe, or they'll have kind of like a contract acreage thing. I don't necessarily know why corporations would want to take on that kind of risk, but they might. Well, what has that funneled us into? More corn and soybeans. As everybody, what was the model? In the 80s, guys were usually pretty diversified. And then 95, 96, the corn went super crazy and the cattle guys got kind of wiped out. Then in 98, the hog guys got wiped out. In 2009, it was the dairy guys that got kind of hurt. We've had these little pulses of consolidation. Well, now we're down to what? Corn and soybeans. Because what happens? You get rid of the livestock. The old guys want to take their time. They're having fun farming. They've had a great life and they've had a good run. And now, where are we at? We've got two crops that everybody's in a 50-50 rotation on, and I'm talking mostly majority of the Corn Belt, because that's, in my mind, what most of the ag policy coming from government is focused on. Obviously you have your specialty crops up north and stuff down in the south, but I mean, even cotton is not a profitable crop right now. So acres that used to be the fringe that could grow things like peanuts and rice and other things are even getting consolidated to the point where they're trying to look like Iowa.
Let's take a quick break and hear a word from our sponsor today, the Tire Winder. Is the shortage of labor keeping you from your pasture management goals? Have you thought about adding more paddocks to your rotation but can't find the time? Or has electric fencing become just another endless chore? If you answered yes, then let the Tire Winder ATV attachment become the key to unlock effective electric fencing for you. The Tire Winder attachment simply mounts to your ATV rack and is ground-driven off your wheel. Equipped with half-mile capacity spools and a front post basket, you can take the headache out of fencing. Imagine building or taking down electric fence from your ATV in one pass. No more walking. Turn your ATV into a hero and slay your fencing nightmares. Come check out this American-made tool that we've all been needing at www.tirewinder.com. Follow us on Facebook or give Daniel a call and have a rancher-to-rancher conversation about how the Tire Winder can help you. So what are some of the challenges facing these two styles of management, particularly the two that are kind of the existing paradigm dominating the most, especially of the I states and other heavily agricultural states? What do you think are some of the challenges that are particular to them?
Well, let's look at it. What was the crying all summer about? Input prices. Everybody's worried about the monopolization. We're down to 4 seed corn companies, or a handful of seed corn companies. You got a handful of fertilizer companies and just a handful of chemistry companies. And that is their Achilles heel in my mind. The longer we go with this consolidation, at some point, we run out of track. We run out of road. Okay. And the model no longer works for anybody. And I feel like that's kind of where we're at. Every time government, they were talking all summer about giving a payment for soybeans because of trade issues or whatever. Every time any kind of a payment comes out like that, what does that do? It compresses margins further out. So if you're guaranteed you're going to get, say $50 an acre, or buck a bushel, or whatever it ends up being, where does that get bid to? There's some research that says that only 30% of any government payment actually makes it into the farmer's pockets. The rest is just pass through. So we've had this basically, if you're playing the game properly, you keep getting shoved into smaller and smaller buckets, and the funnel gets a little narrower. Um, and profitability and margins get squeezed. So where does that ultimately lead? To
Collapse.
less profitability and less margin. Yes, at some point, that's where we end up. So I've been advocating for the young guys is we need to get into whatever the old guys are getting out of. Look for opportunities that they do not want or they can't see or they can't take on. Whether it's more physical, whether it's more, smaller parcels, whatever business model that the big guys are in, kind of go find the around the edges where they can't maneuver. Um, you know, smaller pieces of land, stuff like that, because you're never going to be able to compete with them head to head. They're too specialized, they're too refined. Their business model is they can command more capital than a young guy ever will be able to. So how do we get another generation in on this agriculture thing? Because the old guys are not going to live forever. Like the expiration date is there. So what do you do? And this is another challenge for the multi-gen guys: is how do they navigate succession plans? How do they navigate land transfers? How do we navigate all of those issues, that are coming down the pipe that nobody seems willing to take on head to head? Very few people seem to really want to, face their mortality, which is kind of understandable. Nobody wants this kind of uncomfortable conversation, but it's coming, and there's a lot of them. And this whole industry is going to be facing this in the next decade.
And you said in your tweet thread that one of the things, particularly to the fourth and fifth gen farms and those things, are one of the particular struggles that they're going to face is the succession will especially be problematic for them. Why is it? What is driving the succession, particularly for them, being a challenge?
Well, think about it. I mean, I've witnessed it in our neighborhood. The elderly, extreme elderly, I'm talking like in their 90s, own a large portion of land. Well, their kids are in their 60s or 70s. So this transfer that's going to happen, what happens with all the off-farm heirs? That seems to be something that most people haven't figured out how to handle. I've witnessed it where 94-year-old landowner dies. It goes to 5 siblings. They're all in their 60s and 70s. Okay. Well, they're all spread out. They're at the end of their life, their career and such. So what they maybe wanted as younger people is no longer the same as what they now want now. So more than likely, they want the cash out of that farm so that they can go do whatever they want to do, their retirement or maybe short up retirement or buy a vacation house or whatever. That farm is no longer, that land especially, is no longer a viable alternative for them. So what happens? It gets sold. And we've seen that. We've seen a lot of that. So what happens with that money? That gets dispersed out to those heirs and is no longer part of the farm community. It gets getting extracted. So somebody else buys the land. Is it a outside investor? Is it another bigger farmer who's maybe in his 50s or 60s and is looking to increase his? It's the consolidation thing. Well, we are now at the point where we have an astronomical amount of acres, and I should look up exactly what it is. It is an astronomical amount of acres about to move simply because of farm transition due to death.
Yeah, and I think that I watched your talk at the Minnesota Soil Health Conference, and
Yep,
it was a really really great talk, and I appreciated one slide in particular on there where you talked about really our number of acres under management for agriculture hasn't changed that much, but what has changed is we've gone from 7 some odd million farms at one point down to just like 1.2, 1.2 million farms now, or 1.8 million farms now.
Right. It's that consolidation. So what happens in that transition? Are we going to keep getting bigger and bigger? I mean, there's some talk that, people are going to, you'll have like 5 guys farming a county. Well, our county has like 300,000 acres in it. That's not going to happen. Just the logistics in our area are not conducive to that type of farming. Maybe on the plains or certain areas, the upper, North Dakota or whatever, where big fields and more, typical soil type. Around our area, you're just not going to have that. We were considered dairy country in southeast Wisconsin simply because the fields were small and we could grow a lot of forage. So I've been advocating. I think we're going to have a lot of Oh, we're going to have a return to small. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know if that's niche production. I don't know if that's like in the dairy thing, maybe a pair of robots and 120 cows. I don't know. A lot of unknowns because we haven't figured out what the new cycle is. We just kind of know that the old cycle is not going to work anymore, you know. And you look at the increasing carryout for corn and the just the lack of supply in say the cattle market. Kind of wonder the cattle numbers, I should say. A cow herd small since 1951 or even 46 now. I think at this point, um, there's going to be opportunity. We just don't know what that is
And
yet.
this whole conversation reminds me of kind of one of those business principles that and I don't know that it was ever one thing and not the other, probably one thing more than the other at different times, but the idea that the big eat the small has kind of dominated
Yep.
the landscape for a number of years, and now I think we're going to see this transition to the fast eat the slow,
Yeah.
and so that's kind of what you're talking about is that they've got the first gen guys in the pickup truck on the gravel road with the trailer have the ability to turn, go the other direction, or even just go cross country and find opportunity. And so what are some of the things that you're seeing or thinking about as, hey, these are opportunities that exist now? I know you've said multiple times, and I agree, we can't predict the future. We don't know what it's going to look like. We know it's going to change. We know we're facing a big transition of some kind. We don't know what it's all going to look like in the end, but what are some of the things that you're seeing happening right now that are presenting themselves as opportunities for the first gen guys?
I think there's opportunity in livestock. I really do, especially with the cover crops and the amount of forage we can grow, and just the lack of infrastructure. Let's be honest, a lot of the old guys, they don't want to mess with cattle. So there's a lot of land that is not being utilized the way it probably should be or could be. Pastures that are sitting idle or have been ripped up and as more people have been shoehorned into corn and soybean, and that as the margin bleeds out of that, there's going to be opportunity for guys to grow forage and graze cattle going ahead because the dollars will be there. One thing we've noticed with our dairy herd is there used to be so when ethanol first came out, there used to be deals on byproducts. So wet distillers grains or dry distillers grains or gluten or candy meal or whatever. And what we've kind of noticed is as the margins got squeezed on those products, there was never there hasn't been the deal. It used to be, they'd have a fire sale on wet distillers for $20 a ton, whatever you could take, because the dryer went down. Well, now they've refined their processes as well as anything to where there's no margin there anymore, as far as feeding. So what that has done is that's shifted us back towards being able to grow our own products. And because the costs on all of those inputs have gone up so much, suddenly, we're growing multi-species cover crops and we're able to dollar out the pounds of forage and the value in that crop in a way that it makes sense to feed it to cattle. And we haven't really had that for the last decade or two because it always seemed like there was a cheaper product you could bring in. Well, now things are changing. The more people that get into corn and soybeans, the more opportunity there's going to be different, I should say. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I was just talking to Brett McCrae about grazing standing corn, and he said that one of the things that what he's figured out is that they can get up to 400 animal days per acre out of grazing standing corn in the winter. I mean, like he gets 18 to 20 inches of rain a year.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
what is that worth right now? When you're looking
exactly.
at the prices in the cattle market, what is it worth to be able to do that? So
the value of gain is there. So yes, it's going to take a huge amount of capital, but there's room to maneuver for young guys, in my opinion, if they can get some of this land locked down. Now, is that a given? Absolutely not, because here's the problem. The one big beautiful bill, from what I've seen, it basically codified into law everything that got us to where we are. Which in my mind, everyone's going to go, oh, it's just going to keep going the same. No. It accelerates the breakdown because things like crop insurance, when it was a sweetheart deal at 65%, is now an even sweeter deal at 80%. Okay. With you can buy up ECO and SCO, and now you have ARC and PLC, and they've increased the payment limits on everything. That has accelerated, and we're now at the parabolic stage where it can no longer just keep going on. The deals have gotten so sweet for the incentives, I should say, have gotten so sweet for the farming and it is now literally the path of least resistance. Well, what happens when you have an entire generation, a bunch of the old guys with short time horizons at the end of their career? They will not change at all because there's no incentive to. Okay, so this is what is kind of good for the young guys. It leaves opportunity on the table for the young guys because there's a bunch of the old guys that are never going to make any changes. They're not going to go put a fence up. They're not going to go cut trees out of fence lines to be able to string more wire. They're not going to want to break waters in the winter. That gives opportunity for the young guys that are willing to do that. And there's a lot of young guys out there willing to do that. They just have to have hope that they can actually succeed if they stick their neck out.
How do you go about realizing those opportunities? I mean, is it you got to knock on the right door, go to the right conference, make the right friends? What are some of the ways that you think that it takes to realize these opportunities?
I think first off, you have to believe it's possible, and then you have to get uncomfortable and start knocking on doors and figuring it out. And it kind of depends. Have you got knowledge? Or are you starting literally from bare zero? Because what I did is I went and worked for a guy who fed cattle. And I told him before I started, I said, I want you to teach me how to farm. And I learned literally by doing. He taught me how to farm because I worked for him for 7 years. You start at the bottom. You learn the business from guys that are doing it. Go to work and figure it out that way. Now, it could be, I can only really speak to my area or whatever, but there's opportunity out there, just from the forage end. Little bitty batches of woodlots that are going untouched, or small, 2 and 3 acre pieces of, for hay or whatever. There's always opportunity out there. You just have to go looking for it. Put it this way, you are not going to be able to compete with the big guys. So don't even get into a fair fight with anybody who's got more money than you. Like, don't do it. It's not worth competing in that.
You kind of wrapped up the tweet thread by saying this, that if enough time lapses, a bunch of them can get together. They can always dig or blow up the tracks of the trains if there comes a need to disrupt the system. What are you thinking about there?
So when I put that together, think about it, okay? If everybody is super dependent on those railroad tracks, that is, anytime we've had a system that is ultra dependent on any one or two variables, it becomes very brittle. Okay, so it's vulnerable to disruption. And like I said, the path of least resistance is right now is corn and soybeans. They're being rewarded to stay on that train track. What happens when a bunch of young guys figure out a disruptive model? Whether it's alley cropping and double cropping like Jason Mock is doing, or it's integrated livestock management. What happens when that system that is kind of ossified, highly dependent on, inputs and everything staying exactly the same, government policy, what happens when that gets disrupted? The young guys are going to be able to disrupt that model over time. We don't know what it looks like.
Right. And I mean, so you would agree, I'm sure. In the illustration, there is some vandalism or destruction of property, that sometimes if people are held down or kept from being able to get into the market for long enough, they're willing to do things that are maybe less than ethical to accomplish their.
Yeah, but it also could be a disruptive business model.
Right.
It could be a completely direct marketing thing. Or take a look at the carnivore diet. That's a consumer model that I guess I don't really think very many people had on their radar. But look at the cattle prices we've had because of that. So if you can catch a wave on a consumer trend going forward, how vulnerable has soybean production been to Chinese purchases? Okay, so it doesn't necessarily have to be a vandalism or something like that. It could be literally the trains are too heavy as they go over a railroad track or over a railroad bridge.
Sure.
It could be the system itself, falls apart.
Yeah,
We plant 105 million acres of corn next year, and carryout goes way up. Or suddenly Brazil plants a huge amount. I saw a tweet here from Brazil that saying they were trying to grow 200 million metric tons of soybeans for next year. Okay. It was not that long ago that they were only at 100. So talk about vulnerable, there's some issues there, and it may not necessarily be something that the young guys are doing. It could just be that the system itself has kind of run out of track.
Big is fragile, right? I think that was I don't know, the first person I heard say that I think was Temple Grandin said that big is
Yep.
fragile. And
Yep.
so that's a good point. So what can the BTOs, and especially I think even more than them, the fourth and fifth generation guys, what are some things that they can do to help alleviate this? Like, and an example I'm thinking of is open up some of those corners of the fields. This is a biblical principle, right? Let them glean the corners of the field. Whether it's let them run some cows in the corners or in the acres that you can't farm or whatever, just some of those examples. What are some things that you think that maybe the BTOs and the fourth and fifth generation operators can do to help alleviate this current situation?
There's going to be some collaborations, meaning everybody has unproductive acres, and by that I mean lower yielding or harder to farm. Maybe they're wetter. Those kind of spots are just absolute gold for a young guy trying to get in. If you can clear some tree lines and work with a young guy to figure out how to farm that differently, going forward, there's going to have to be some diversification, because obviously if you're kind of locked in on two crops, how do you grow another crop? We used to have wheat. Well, now we don't even have that. So I guess in my mind, I would be looking for any and every exit off ramp, a way to diversify production. Is it running cows on corn stalks? I mean, there's millions of acres of corn stalks that just go to waste every year, get tilled under, that could be turned into cow feed. Theoretically, we should be able to build the cow herd right now. With the amount of forage out there, I mean, hay prices are in the dumpster in our area, at least, because we have had a lot of good crops. If you can grow forage, you should be able to find a way to utilize it. So I would be looking at diversifying production somehow. And a lot of guys are going to be, it's too much work. Well, it is. It's going to be a little more work. It's going to require a different set of skills. There's guys out there that are completely turning crop production on their heads in an effort to figure out and hack the system to gain more opportunity than just growing one crop for 120 days every year, every season. Guys doing cover crops. There's guys growing their own nitrogen. There's ways to do it. Again, it's going to be very context specific.
Sure. I think that one of the other realities that's kind of going along with all of this is, the lack of financial infrastructure or people who understand agriculture in these places where they're controlling dollars that could be used to help somebody get started, right? Like financial institutions, banks, and that. They don't have the bankers that understand, right? And somebody that can kind of walk alongside those guys trying to get started and help them along the way. And so that mentorship piece is going to be a big part of it too, I would guess.
Knowledge is going to be, I think, in my mind, our biggest, and the ability to practically apply knowledge is going to be one of our biggest shortfalls. There's a huge amount of knowledge in that older generation, and if they don't have anybody coming back, where does that go? If it isn't being shared and basically apprenticed to somebody younger, what happens to all that knowledge? It disappears. And then we're really in trouble, because that saddles the next generation to make the same mistakes that the elder generation may have made. Whereas if somebody would told you, don't do that, I've tried that, it didn't work, that may save a lot of trouble and heartache and stuff. So knowledge is going to be huge. The other thing is, like I say, the financial and actually the how do we physically get this stuff done? What I'm noticing is a lot of the smaller equipment, a lot of the older equipment, things that can be worked on that aren't conducive to the bigger models. Maybe they can't run enough throughput through them. That equipment is falling in price rapidly, to the point where it's like, if a guy can weld and turn a wrench, he can buy some pretty low cost equipment and still compete. He's not going to be able to go the fastest or cover the most acres, but he's going to actually be able to get started. Look on Facebook Marketplace and the sheer volume of old equipment that is still functional. You can turn it into something that is low cost, that has just been sitting in barns and sheds. There's opportunity there because the big guys don't want it, and the old guys or the barn finds or whatever, the family has no use for it. So there's going to be opportunities going from there, low cost way.
Is there a better, or are there other sources of transferring that knowledge other than just one-to-one contact? Are there resources or things that have helped
Talk about
you
Twitter?
grow? Well, you can do whatever you want. I don't care.
I think Twitter and the network that can be built off of social media, if it's used properly, is an absolute asset to the young guys. I mean, quite frankly, I've met a lot of people off of Twitter that I never would have interacted with anywhere else. So the hive mind or the crowdsourcing of ideas is a fantastic piece that most people are not tapping into. Hey, we're doing this trial here. It's showing up. We're growing this kind of forage here, or this mix here. Or, hey, this is what we're doing. There's a huge opportunity there for the young guys to kind of hack the system in a way. The future looks incredibly bright. I mean, I don't want anybody listening to this to think, oh man, we're screwed. There's going to be a lot of opportunity if you're willing to step out and basically create what the future that we want. That's where we're at. It's going to be incredibly fun in the next 5 years, 10 years, as because you're basically going to have the horizon to yourself in some regard. The more everybody gets shoehorned into one model and is locked into inputs and locked into big equipment, because they're chasing the throughput, and they're locked into having to deliver bushels here and into a model that doesn't work any longer, or I don't perceive to work much longer. There's going to be a huge amount of opportunity going forward.
Well, and I think that, you make so many good points, but one of them is just the vulnerability of that large system to one stroke of the pen. When we live in the administrative state, and so because of that, the administrative branch can change so much in just one day, one moment. No legislative action really required. Just, this is what we're doing now, because I said so as the chief executive of this country, and so I think that's one of the things that now, and with the shrinking population of farmers, the fewer number of farmers, when they get loud and angry about the change, it matters less and less all the time. Do you think that's accurate?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, let's look at, okay, we're recording this on a Monday. What was it, Wednesday, that there was a tweet about bringing in Argentine beef? So, and the cattle market has basically been limit down and expanded limit down. Feeders have lost, I don't know, $40, $50, something like that, just in the last 4 or 5 trading sessions. So talk about being vulnerable. The flip side of that is soybeans have been stagnant the entire time, and they were up 25 cents today. So there's going to be big swings and chances to make or break, depending on how quick you are to see what's coming. Okay. Do I think, especially in this cattle market, my opinion is this was a overdone thing and it's going to correct too far to the downside. Well, that's going to give guys that are an opportunity this winter. It's the end of October. Who doesn't want to have to break water all winter? Old guys. So is there a chance there's going to be some cattle that get scared out of the countryside that are going to be a good value to some young guy buying right now? Yes. There is going to be opportunities there. And who knows where we'll be by spring. The cattle herd hasn't gotten any bigger. We haven't magically had more cattle. It was a tweet. It was a 2-day basically is what they want to bring in. Is I think it's the total value of the beef is like 2 days worth of our consumption. So it's not even that big of a deal right now, but it pushed the market hard. So there's going to be opportunity if you guys are paying attention. That's going to be probably the biggest takeaway is you're going to have to be super nimble. And yes, if you're vulnerable to disruption, it's going to hurt. The flip side of that is if you're ready and waiting for it, you can probably be okay.
Are there times in history that people could study, do you think, that would help them prepare for what's coming?
Yes, in the 1920s, there's a book called One Summer by Bill Bryson, and it's about 1927, right before the crash. Um, that one's a good one because there's a lot of similarities between now and then, and it's more about human nature. Obviously, I would say the Old Testament as well because we have there's a lot of similarities between what goes on, with human nature. Understand human nature, and everything becomes a little more clear.
Yeah.
You figure how failed we are.
Right. J.R. Burdick said the other day that he thinks that 90% of the problems we face as humans can be captured in the first three chapters of Genesis. I said, I think it's more like 100%, but yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah, pretty close. But not to get too spiritual on you, but yeah, humans have a history of making the same mistakes over and over and over. And just like we are today, we're going to take things too far, and we're going to figure out that model wasn't sustainable, and out of that comes new opportunity.
Okay, so how about we wrap up by having you pitch a positive vision for a balanced approach to American agriculture? What would that look like in your vision?
In my mind, okay, let's paint it for a guy who's 25. He's working somewhere. He's scratched together a little bit of money. He can somehow get some land rented. Obviously, that's a big if, but say he can get 20 or 50 acres of land rented. He doesn't have to buy that much equipment. If he can get a landowner that is willing to have it fenced or is okay with having cattle on the property, you can grow forage. Right now, I think in the next 5 years, I think we've got a pretty good runway as far as the cattle herd. I think that's where one of the opportunities is going to be. Sheep, potentially. I think livestock is where it's going to be at. I'm not so sure on the dairy market right now. We're in the dairy market, and I don't know. That one is so regulated, I'm not sure where to go with that. But I think the closer you can get to the consumer, so back to the guy with a handful of cattle, you can grow forage. If you can graze them intelligently, there's lots of resources out there. You can learn what to do. I think you're going to have opportunity. Get closer to the consumer if you can. With today's day and age, if you can set up a website or market through social media, I think there's some potential there. And you got to have the grit to do it. But I think there's going to be some potential, especially in the direct marketing, livestock, especially because there's a knowledge base there that's going to keep a lot of competitors out, especially as like the consolidation happens on the livestock side. It's going to make you stand out that much more. And that gives me hope. I think there's going to be some bright spots there.
Very good. Adam, I appreciate the way you think, and thanks for taking the time to join me today.
No worries.
Very good stuff there with Adam. I really appreciate his perspective, again, the way he thinks, and just the people who are willing to see the opportunity, people who are not willing to say, well, it's harder to get started now than ever. We're just having a conversation about this with our son. Land is continuing to appreciate in value, continues to be a good investment. If you can find a way to make it happen, it's a great place to start. So really appreciate that conversation. Coming up next on the Working Cows podcast, we're going to have a conversation with Dr. Alan Williams and Kyle Richardville of Understanding Ag about the blessings of agriculture. Really fascinating conversation. Really get a chance to see kind of the depth and breadth of Dr. Williams' thinking and his perspective, and really fun to get to know Kyle, a guy who's got his own set of unique perspectives living in the UK, but from America, and the opportunities that has presented for his own education. So look forward to sharing that with you, coming your way real soon on another episode of the Working Cows podcast. We'll see you then.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.